name is Karen Stangroom and welcome to Conquer Crochet, the channel for tips, tricks and techniques for conquering your crochet. If you're new here, please consider subscribing down below and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss a single stitch. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how you can join your granny squares together. This is part of my granny square series. If you've missed any of the other videos in the granny square series, I'll put a link in the cards above. Okay then, so to start off, I've made a slip knot in my piece of thread. As I say, I'm using a contrasting colour rather than the matching colour which you would ordinarily use. So thread in my needle. Now going back to the granny squares, this is what we call the right side of the granny square. If I turn it over, this is the wrong side. The stitches look slightly different. Everything sort of seems a bit bumpier on the back side of it. Okay, so I want the right sides together. So I'm going to fold them on top of each other so that you can see where your stitches are going to be. So I'm going to start in the corner, and in the corner you have 3 stitches or 3 chains. You may only have 2 chains if you decided to do just 2 chain corners, and if in that case you'd go into the second chain. But for this one, 1, 2, 3, we're going to go into that middle chain, that second chain. So I'm going into the middle of that chain there and into the middle of this one here. So 1, 2, 3, I need to go in here. And I'm going to put my needle into that slip knot, and I'm going to just tighten it up a little bit. And I'm going to pull my yarn through that slip knot, just to give it a little bit of extra support. So we've gone through one, so now I'm going to go through the second one, and then I'm going over the top each time. So now this time I'm going through the top of these trebles here. So I need to make sure where you've got your V shape, I'm going through both of the V's, so that would be 1, that's 2, that's 3, and that's 4, so on both sides. Take it back over the top. Now I'm going into the next stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't pull them too tight, otherwise your work will squash up together. A decent tension but not too tight is best, and it really is practice. So we need to go 1, 2, 3, 4. And be careful here because we're going through this chain space here, so make sure that we are actually going through that chain. You can go through the gap if you want to, and if you do decide to do that, I would make sure that you do the same in both gaps. As long as you're consistent, it shouldn't really make a difference. You're not going to see it if you have a matching yarn. And 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now you might find it easier to hold this on a table and use the table for support. You might find that you need to have it much closer up. It's entirely up to you how you do it, as long as you're going through those 4 chain spaces at the top there. Right, back to the chain space here, so making sure I'm going through the chain, so I haven't gone underneath it. You can still see that there is part of the stitch underneath. I need to do the same for this one. And 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we're coming up to our corner again, and I started here in that middle one, so I need to finish in the middle one here. One, two, three, four. I missed a stitch there. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then through the middle one. 1, 2, 3, 4. I then need to get rid of this end. Now you could tie a knot and weave in the end, or you could weave it through your stitches and that shouldn't, if you've done it 3 times, you shouldn't have to tie a knot. If you want to tie a knot because you feel that's safer, absolutely fine. So what you get on the front side, this is our right side now, so what you get there is this very simple whip stitch going up through the middle, and then on the reverse of that you get slightly more of a bump on the back, and it's really up to your personal preference. If you would prefer to have that as a design feature on your blanket or scarf, whatever it is you're making, then you can do that, and make sure you always sew with your right sides together, your wrong sides together. It's entirely up to you how you prefer to do it. Okay, so for method 2, I'm going to start with my piece of sewing thread or yarn, and again I'm going to make a slip knot to use at the ends, to tie, at the beginning, to tie in my thread to make sure it's nice and secure. I'm going to go into the 3rd chain this time, so 1, 2, 3. You can go into the 2nd one if you want to. So I'm going into the 3rd chain and the 3rd chain on this one. So that's 1, 2, 3. Go through the slip knot, pull it tight, and that should be all nice and secure there. Okay, so in this method we're going to be going under the posts. Now a post is the tall part of the crochet stitch. So you have your bottom here, you have the top of the stitch, and this is your post. So the first stitch we're going to do is to go under that first post. Then I'm going to take my yarn across and go under the first post on the other granny square. And again, don't need to pull them too tight, but it needs to be tight enough. Just take that tail out of the way. You can weave the tail in if you want to as you're going along. So being under the first one of each one, so I come back to the first granny square under that 2nd treble, cross over to the 2nd granny square and under the 2nd treble there. Back over to the 1st square and under the 3rd treble, and under the 3rd treble in the 2nd granny square. So if I pull that quite tight, you can see that that's pretty much disappearing into the stitch underneath, and if this was the same colour excuse me, you really wouldn't notice it at all. So as with the previous method, when you come to your chain spaces, you need to make sure that whichever method you choose to do, you do the same in each chain space. So I'm just going to sew underneath, so through both of those chain spaces, and then cross back over underneath the treble, underneath this next treble, under the second treble, and just keep checking to make sure you are going under the opposite stitches, otherwise you'll end up with wonky squares. Now going into the third treble, as I say, if you prefer to sort of hold it up closer to you as you're doing this, then that's fine. Obviously I'm doing this so I can demonstrate to you how it works. Now the invisible stitch is really useful if you're making clothing and you don't want sort of the bulkiness of this sort of ridge happening on your work. So I'm going to go under the first treble, cross over under the first, under the second, and under the second here, under the third, under the third one here. I'm just going to give it a little pull just so I can tighten up all those stitches. I don't want to put it too tight. If you put it too tight, you'll end up with bunching. You just need to sort of play around, ease those stitches out a little bit, make sure it's not too obvious to see. And actually that looks like it's just been, you've carried on crocheting in a different way. So with the next method I'm going to show you, we need to make sure that our granny squares are facing each other the right way. So I wouldn't want a back, a wrong side and a right side facing. So I want two right sides, and I'm going to put them together because we're going to sew down this seam here. So I'm going to make my slip knot, thread my needle, and I'm going to join in the third chain on that corner. 1, 2, 3. So make sure I'm going through both of those granny squares and through the slip knot, and then just pull that tail to tighten it up. Okay, so we're going to be going through the back loops. So on our granny square we have our V shapes for each of the tops of those stitches from the previous row. So if we were on the right side, the back loop would be the one furthest away from us. But as we flip that over, that becomes the one closest to us. So on this granny square, we go into the back loop here. But on this granny square, we need to go into the one that's furthest away. So it's the nearest one and the furthest one. And we get rid of that pesky little tail out the way. And then we bring the yarn back over. So I'm going through the nearest one and then the furthest one. That's the nearest one here. We want the furthest one there. Again, we want the nearest one and the furthest one. The nearest one and the furthest one. Notice how I'm actually making sure I'm trying to keep my stitches even. I'm not pulling them too tight, but that they have got some sort of tension there. So I'm going through the nearest one to me and the one furthest away from me. So that would be the front loop, that's the back loop. Except I went through the front loop, hang on, there we go. nearest, furthest, nearest, furthest. And we just carry this all the way along until we have sewn up our granny squares. Front loop, back loop. Oops. That one and that one. So now we're coming up to our corner again, and as with all the other stitches, you need to make sure you are being consistent. So we went through the first chain, we need to go through the chain here and the chain here. Make sure we're happy. So let's open that out, and you can see you get a very nice, neat stitch down there, which again you won't see if you're using the same colour, but you do get this slight little ridge on your work. But that can actually add to the design feature. So there we have it, our 3 methods of stitching together our granny squares. Now, depending what your topic is, will depend which method you decide to use. If you were doing a blanket where things were in different colours, you'd probably want to use this invisible stitch, which was the second one that I showed you. In next week's video, I'm going to be showing you some different methods of crocheting your granny squares together. So make sure you've hit that subscribe and the notification bell so you'll be notified when that video is gone live. Thank you very much for joining me today. Don't forget, the subscribe is to hit my face up here, and there are 2 other videos that you might want to watch to help you on your crochet journey. Thank you very much for joining me today. Happy hooking!